really are blessed with three people today to help us walk through the nexus of corporations' corruption, and in particular transnational corruption, and transnational corruption on steroids in the global financial system as it has evolved, and democracy. So I don't want to delay us. I'm going to introduce our three panelists in the order in which they're initially going to speak. Professor Luigi Zingales is the Robert C. McCormick Distinguished Service Professor. I love this title, of Entrepreneurship and Finance at the University of Chicago, where he also directs the Stiegler Center. And he's been refocusing the work of that center on promoting and diffusing research on themes dear to this conference: regulatory capture and the distortions that special interest groups impose on capitalism. I think you all know his work, which spans from corporate governance to financial development, from political economy to the economic effects of culture. And he's also widely known for having co-developed the Financial Trust Index, which is designed to monitor the level of trust that Americans have toward their financial system. Our second, and Luigi is going to frame our discussion here in part by presenting a paradigmatic case of transnational corruption. Our second speaker is really on the front lines of this battle. I would like to thank him for the work he is doing to fight this, I'd say, war against transnational corruption and money laundering. He is Alexander Wilson. Alex is co-chief of the Money Laundering and Transnational Criminal Enterprises Unit of the Department of Justice in the front line of the battle, the Southern District of New York. He supervises there the prosecution of criminal violations of US economic sanctions and of the Bank Secrecy Act by financial institutions, as well as third-party money launderers and international organized crime groups. Previously, he was the assistant US attorney in the Complex Frauds and Cyber Crime Unit, prosecuting primarily computer hacking and related cyber crime offenses, as well as white-collar fraud. So what a blessing to have this on-the-ground perspective. Finally, our third speaker, and then we'll engage in a conversation among all three of them and then bring you in as participants and commentators, is Professor Kevin Davis, the Beller Professor of Business Law at NYU. He teaches courses there on contracts, commercial law, and crucially for us, regulation of foreign corrupt practices. His current research is focused on contract law, anti-corruption law, and the general relationship between law and economic development. And he has a wide experience teaching in Canada at the University of Toronto, and has also had visiting researcher teaching appointments at the University of Southern California, Cambridge University, Fundacio Getulio Vargas in Sao Paulo, and the University of the West Indies in Barbados. So without further ado, and I've really been looking forward to this, it's my pleasure now to call on Luigi for his opening presentation.
Thank you very much, Larry. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
So thank you to you for the kind words, and thanks for Anat to organize such a fantastic conference. Since we're talking about corruption, I think it's useful to define what we're going to talk in this session, because corruption is a very wide term. There is the petty corruption, the $50 you slip into the hands of a custom agent in Nigeria to get your booze in. There is the grand corruption, that is when you pay the Ministry of Oil of Nigeria to get a contract. And there is the institutional corruption, the one that Larry said, where you do a campaign donation in the United States and surprise, surprise, you get some desired outcome. I think that what I want to focus in my talk is on the second one, on the grand corruption. And you will understand why this is particularly important when we come to the issue of cooperation. And as Larry Diamond presented a few years ago, now the numbers might have changed because the oil price have changed, but this is an enormous important topic, especially for Africa, for developing country. Larry estimates that in the next decade, roughly $3 trillion in royalties will be or should be paid to the people in Africa. So if you figure out that 10% of that can be easily misappropriated through corruption, then you have 300 billion that can be misappropriated and not only not used to promote the development in Africa, but also bring to corruption in the Western economies and all over the world. So I think is a priority to fight this corruption. And now corruption is a particularly hard crime to fight because it takes two to tango. And so there are two ways to do it. One is trying to criminalize who receive the bribes. And that's very difficult to do, especially when these people live in foreign jurisdiction, etc. The other, which is the FCPA route, is to criminalize who pays the bribe. And in particular, when it comes to oil, we are pretty fortunate that the fact that all the major oil companies are traded in the New York Stock Exchange. And so they are all subject to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So one question that I had as a scholar before I joined some corporate boards is to what extent people at the board level can stop or contribute to fight corruption. And so what I want to discuss here is my experience in two Italian corporate boards. The most relevant one is the one on ENI or ENI, depending on the word you want to pronounce. This is a company that is the 8th largest oil company in the world, the largest company in Italy. So we're talking about a very, very important company. And there are two unique opportunities. One is that I sat on that board for a little bit more than a year. And while I've seen the result of investigation that were done on acts that took place before my presence on the board, and one imply a subsidiary, and there is at least some conviction there at some level of the Italian jurisprudence. It's very complicated in Italy, so I don't go into the details. The second one is a case that is still out for trial, so I don't want to prejudge the results. But the reason why I'm at liberty of describing some of these things is that I testify in court in this trial of what I've seen and what are the procedure. And so I think I want to report some of this to explain two things. Number one is that board members can see where something wrong is going on. However, they have no incentives to do so. So let me first start with the what that you can see. So the benefit of focusing on grand corruption is big. So one of the two episodes is a intermediation fee that a subsidiary any pay to a strange company. And this order, the order of magnitude was $240 million, okay? So the great things about our colleagues in accounting, and especially the SOX, make very difficult to hide 240 million out of your income statement, thank God. So this is reported, and when it comes to decision at this level, they must pass through the board of directors, and the board of directors are required to do some due diligence. And I was initially very skeptical about the due diligence, but having seen the due diligence people do, is actually not that easy to go around that. Now, I wish we had even further transparency of ultimate ownership and so on and so forth. But in the case of the subsidiary of ENI, the 240 million were paid to a intermediary that did not even have a website and was located in a country that is considered a country at risk, like Lebanon, and so on and so forth. And so there are a number of due diligence that you can pass or you can do to avoid this from happening. And the case, the more controversial case, which is still be decided, I don't want to go into all the details because it will take me forever, but at least the first approval that took place at the board level was an approval to pay $1 billion to a company that the internal due diligence was saying was formerly owned, was actually owned by the former Ministry of Oil, who basically misappropriated this license, awarding himself the license for $20 million, something that is worth $1 billion. Eventually, this transaction did not take place in this form, but at least the initial approval of the board existed for this transaction. So what I want to say is it is possible for board members to actually stop it. And it's possible to do something very simple, which is when people make mistakes, you fire them. If the subsidiary of, well, actually was a subsidiary of the subsidiary of any, and some board members signed this intermediation contract without having done the due diligence. And so you would expect that the people who did this mistake will be fired. In fact, these people was promoted. And when I started to basically point this out, that say, if you promote somebody who does something wrong, this becomes a criminal organization, not a corporation. I was quickly isolated, and basically I ended up resigning from the board, which I'm very happy to have done, because I did not want to participate in an organization with those principles. But what is interesting is I have a pretty now good board experience, 7 years in another company and 1.5 years in this company, which are both at the level of international company quoted in NYSE. But no other company ever asked me to join the board. I became persona non grata in the board community because I spoke up. And so the problem here is not that board members cannot stop corruption, is that their incentives are completely in the opposite direction, are to basically trying to pretend they don't see what's happening, because if they do, they stop being board members. And so by revealed preference, if you join a board, means that you care about being on a board. And if you care about that more than you care about your reputation, and you keep going as much as you can. So I think that the problem we have is we have some rules in place, but these rules in place, in my view, are not strong enough to create the incentives for individual board members to stop the process. And it's a pity, because I think that by creating these incentives, you could really turn around a lot of companies and turn around, in my view, a lot of countries. Thank you. You're mute, Larry, you're mute.
Thank you. I was thanking you for getting us off so constructively and provocatively. And I have a lot of questions I already want to ask you, but we're going to move on to Alex Wilson. Alex?
Thanks very much, Larry. So a couple of preliminaries that I should go through, and then let me talk a little bit about the legal framework that applies to this, sort of give that as a way to think about some of these issues. The preliminary is there's a disclaimer that I have to make, particularly since we're being recorded, which is that I do not speak for the Department of Justice. I am just my humble self. I have my views. I'm going to talk to you today about what I think, but I always find this to be a weird thing that I'm required to do, because it's hard for me to believe that many of you thought like Bill Barr calls me every morning and checks on what I think about corruption and corporations and the FCPA. But to the extent any of you had that misimpression, that's not a call that I get. So I am just one man speaking here today. The other thing that's perhaps less obvious is I'm going to be a little limited in what I can say about some of the specifics of particular matters, particularly since Luigi has raised it about the any case, just because those are the types of things that can be investigated by the department. And so at a high level of abstraction, I can talk about some of this stuff, but I am unlikely to be able to comment on sort of the nitty-gritty facts in case it is something that it is ultimately litigated by probably not me, but by someone in the Department of Justice. So with that said, let me just try and give it a high level, the framework of some of the laws that govern these types of issues. I should make clear that I'm going to focus on the criminal laws that I enforce and prosecute rather than the regulatory side of this. But there is an entire apparatus, particularly with the Securities and Exchange Commission, that tracks the types of laws we're talking about in the FCPA context and the money laundering context, and that is enforced in cases where criminal prosecution isn't appropriate for various reasons. But since I don't do that, and since we have a limited period of time, I'll talk to you about the criminal side and just be aware that there is an undercurrent of regulatory action that can happen in any sort of circumstance like this, even where the conduct is less egregious. In terms of sort of the criminal laws that impact foreign corruption in particular, there's really two big buckets, right? There's the FCPA side, which is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which Luigi alluded to. Since I have no idea who's on this thing and how much you know about it, here in very basic terms is what the FCPA does. On the one hand, it prevents any, I'm going to talk about US companies for the moment, just to make things easy. It prevents any US company or its agents, its officers, what have you, from bribing foreign officials in order to really impact their business operations in any way. And foreign officials is pretty broadly defined. So you can't be a US company and go bribe someone in Nigeria for an oil concession without violating the FCPA. The second broader requirement is that you have to have a system of internal controls at your company that will, one, prevent you from bribing officials and from detecting it if anyone in your company is doing it, and two, that accounts for all of your corporation's assets and how they're being spent. That's a function of the fact that historically, when you were paying bribes to people overseas, you masked that in all sorts of ways by talking about consulting fees or service payments, and had a whole sort of series of cases, primarily in the 1970s, which generated this, which involved slush funds that had been set up to pay out bribes without really accounting for what the money was. So the FCPA requires that you have to also have a set of rules within your company that make it impossible to do that, or at least reasonably impossible to do that. And so if you intentionally and knowingly don't have that set of controls, you set up your company and you have rules that you know will prevent you from catching the bribes being paid out by your agents in foreign countries, that itself is a criminal offense that you can be prosecuted for. So that's really the FCPA side that's more directly targeted at corruption. The other area where foreign corruption can be impacted by US criminal enforcement is basically in the money laundering context. So US money laundering laws say that it is a crime if you engage in a financial transaction, which is broadly defined, those are any movement of value that either is designed to promote or is designed to conceal the proceeds of foreign crimes involving bribery of public officials, involving embezzlement of government property. I mean, I won't give you the statutory language, but it basically a wide range of foreign legal offenses that touch on public corruption. For both money laundering and the FCPA, a critical feature is that it has to violate foreign law. The way this comes up is a little different in ways I will not trouble you with, but the gist is if it's legal in the country, even if it seems deeply corrupt to us here, you can't be prosecuted for it in the United States. Now, almost no country has formal laws saying it's okay to bribe anyone, so this rarely comes up, but on the margins, it can make things a little bit tricky. I've talked about that in the context of US companies and US persons, but this has wide application internationally. And the Department of Justice has, with some regularity, gone after foreign corporations and employees and agents for this. So first of all, if you're a foreign employee of a US company, you are within the scope of the FCPA, and it doesn't matter that you're not in the United States. Perhaps more importantly, and Luigi alluded to this, if you're a foreign company that trades on a US exchange, particularly through ADRs, which, given that this is a business school conference, you all probably understand better than I do, since the only thing I know about ADRs is that they give me jurisdiction to prosecute people for crimes. But I mean, that is a way to have your foreign stock effectively be traded on a US exchange. And most large foreign companies that are sort of high likelihood of being major FCPA violators tend to trade on the US exchanges in that way. So US law enforcement has jurisdiction over a pretty wide swath of international conduct in this space, as well as just US parties' conduct. The second way we become a little bit, to be pejorative, perhaps, the world's policeman, is that because money laundering charges can be brought on anyone who is moving money through a US bank, and because almost every US dollar transaction that anyone will do anywhere in the world will touch a US bank as part of that transaction, they will flow through a US financial institution. And that makes that a money laundering transaction that we can prosecute, even if the people who are doing it are someone sitting in Italy and someone sitting in Nigeria, as long as it's dollars. And fortunately for me, most of the banks that those go through are in the Southern District of New York. So I have jurisdiction to prosecute those people largely wherever they are. And also, fortunately for me, and I suppose for America, US dollars are still the coin of the realm, and most of your corrupt people seem to want to be paid in them and have not moved to the euros or local currencies in any meaningful way. So most of these cases continue to involve people who are trying to be paid or trying to steal US dollar denominated assets. The last thing that probably makes sense just to frame the further discussion, and then I'll kick it over to others, is individual versus corporate liability, because this really goes a bit to what Luigi was talking about to some extent in terms of sort of board members and their responsibilities and their abilities. So the department's focus, it's been formalized for the last few years by a memo issued by then Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates, but was certainly the Southern District of New York's policy going back decades, is that we want to prosecute individuals, not entities. It doesn't mean that we won't bring cases against corporations. Certainly we do. But the greater deterrent effect, the more just resolutions and punishments are achieved when you can find the individuals who are responsible for the crimes and prosecute them and put them in jail, not take a financial bite out of a corporation. In these contexts, bribery of foreign officials, plainly the person who is involved in the bribe is individually responsible and liable for that. For the money laundering cases, the people who are individually responsible for moving the money are liable. The internal controls cases are trickier because there it's the question of who is responsible for having the internal controls and knowing that they're failing. And that can become that is probably the place where you could see most likelihood for corporate board liability, for example, just because board members are rarely involved at a sufficiently detailed level to know in most cases about money laundering or bribery transactions. Officers may be and often are involved, but boards don't tend to be read into that sort of thing. But if the board is made aware that there are internal controls that are not sufficient to comply with the FCPA and continues to use them, that becomes an interesting question as to whether you could have board liability. The problem is that boards generally don't take action on those things in a way that obviously makes them the decision maker who's properly prosecuted for them. I think Luigi's point is that they could take action to stop it, but just not taking action to stop it becomes very tricky as a theory of criminal liability. And frankly, I don't think the department I'm not sure the department has ever really gone that route with board members who are not also the operational officers directing this sort of conduct. as a practical matter, it is easier to prosecute people for these types of crimes the closer to the ground they are, and becomes harder to prosecute people the farther removed from it. And that is obviously one of the great challenges, both in adequately deterring bad behavior through corporations and in just making individual cases, is the guy in Nigeria who's paying the bribes, first of all, it may be very difficult for us to get to the United States to prosecute, but also the chances of us catching every one of those people isn't that high globally, and therefore the deterrent effect of any one prosecution isn't that significant. What is obviously significant is if you can prosecute corporate executives who were involved in new. How many of those there are out there in the world is a great question. I wish I had a precise answer to. But to the extent they are, that is sort of the best target for the department. If there is a CEO who says, yes, I want to bribe people and we can put that guy in jail, those are the type of people who are most readily deterred. Because if there's a likelihood you're going to jail, being a CEO of a Fortune 500 company that didn't bribe that guy and did slightly less well is a pretty good position to be in. And being a CEO in jail is a rotten one. So the bang for the buck on corporate prosecutions at the executive suite level is, I think, pretty clearly the best where those cases exist. But those, I'm not sure there are that many of those cases. And even if there are, those are always going to be very difficult to prove unless you have insiders at corporations who are coming forward. And that probably goes to sort of challenges and solutions. But my guess is let me pause and let Kevin talk about his perspective, because I'm sure we're going to sort of come back to what to do about all this.
It also goes to why a corporation might not want someone like Luigi Zingales on their board. In any case, Kevin, the floor is now yours.
Great, thanks, Larry. So I thought what I'd do is maybe put what Luigi and Alex have been talking about into somewhat broader perspective, starting with the broader historical perspective and then also the international perspective, because I think both are kind of relevant to understanding what's going on here. Because historically speaking, I think it's safe to say that transnational corruption has been the norm rather than the exception. And it's important to recognize that. I just wrote a book about this last year, and so I decided to go digging through the history. And I found myself going all the way back to Roman times, actually, and how the Romans dealt with corruption of governors in the provinces and so forth. And it was a real problem. They were concerned then not only about the corruption and how it affected the people overseas, but what would happen when those corrupt officials came back home and spent their ill-gotten gains and corrupted the Roman Senate. That was something that Cicero was concerned about. And then you go through the East India Company in the 18th century. This was a big concern of there that people, the nabobs, would go over to India and come back with money. And as one person put it, the breakers of law in India would become the makers of law in England when they bought parliament seats with their ill-gotten gains. So those kinds of concerns were present 2,000 years ago, and they were present in 1976, 77 when the US enacted the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in response to Watergate. Again, the concern about firms paying bribes overseas using these slush funds. And then also the same firms being involved in corruption in the US with sort of illegal contributions to the Republican Party. So I think that historical perspective is important because it shows that it's actually always going to be very difficult to combat this problem. And the idea that states would care about corruption overseas and that corporations and the states, their home states, would care about this is really a recent phenomenon. And it hasn't necessarily caught on everywhere. So, you know, it's still the case that only a relatively handful of jurisdictions vigorously enforce legislation like the FCPA. In a lot of other places, it's viewed as a source of competitive advantage. That's certainly the allegation that's leveled at a lot of Chinese firms, that corruption is part of the process that they use to enter markets. And that's on the bribery side. The other aspect of corruption, of course, is not just the bribery, but the concealment of the proceeds, whether they're proceeds of bribery or proceeds of embezzlement. And I think it's only quite recently that the regulators in places like London and New York and Miami have been concerned about property markets being sort of buoyed up by the proceeds of corruption from around the world. So we've started to see legal initiatives aimed at that, the sort of money laundering laws that Alex was talking about. But again, that's a recent phenomenon. It was for a long time just something that was understood and tolerated with a wink and a nod. So I think that's the historical perspective I wanted to mention. In terms of the legal framework that Alex was talking about, he focused on the criminal law, naturally. I just wanted to point out that for those of you who are thinking about this from a business perspective, criminal sanctions aren't the only thing you have to worry about. You should worry about them because you really don't want to go to jail. People do go to jail for FCPA violations, and my sense of talking to people like Alex and his colleagues is that they're really happiest when they're putting people in jail, actually. But the dollar figures are also significant, not just the fines that are imposed on companies in the criminal proceedings, but there are also civil consequences. And by civil, I just mean the non-criminal side of things. For instance, contracts that are procured through bribery can be canceled, can be terminated by the host country. And there are a lot of instances in which countries have had high-ranking government officials sign contracts. There's a change in government, a set of bribes come to light, and the new government says, well, we'll turn around and cancel that contract and give it to someone else, and we'll keep your money, thank you very much. So that can be, from a business perspective, a very significant legal risk as well. The other point I wanted to mention is that Alex focused on US law, but it is important to recognize that the US is not the only policeman on the anti-corruption beat right now. There aren't that many other policemen, but it's certainly not the only one. It was the first mover with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, enacted back in the 70s. But since the turn of this century, all the other OECD countries have enacted legislation just like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that requires them to prosecute basically their nationals and their companies for paying bribes overseas. And some of them in the past few years have started to enforce those pieces of legislation fairly vigorously. The best known piece of legislation is probably the UK Bribery Act, but Germany has this legislation, the Netherlands, Italy, France, and they have been prosecuting recently. And so that means that firms that are subject to these regimes, so multinationals that are doing business in high-risk jurisdictions, are struggling with how to deal with multiple sources of law, right? First of all, there's the issue of, well, what if there are different standards and expectations for these firms, right? So Luigi was talking about his experience with Eni. That sounded very familiar to me in terms of just what I hear from people in Brazil when they talk about, you know, or in France for that matter, the expectations in some of those countries about monitoring your employees and firing them on a whim are very different. Privacy laws are different, make it harder to collect the sort of information about employees. Labor and employment laws typically make it harder to fire employees for suspicion of corruption or failing to cooperate in an investigation than it would be the case in the United States. It's often harder after the fact when you're running an investigation to tap into some outside expert, either a law firm or an accounting firm with the expertise to run an internal investigation in a way that's sort of sensitive to local context or even in the local language. There are different norms around whistleblowing and turning your colleagues in. In some places that's really viewed as quite despicable in a way that it's still an issue in the US, but the attitudes around it are very different. So when you have a global regime like this that's being administered by a lot of different regulators, it actually becomes quite a challenge for multinationals to sort of adjust the expectations that may have developed in their own culture to the expectations of, say, the US Department of Justice. Aside from the potential for multiple standards, there's also just the overlapping enforcement actions, right? So at the large scale, all of these enforcement actions are basically resolved through settlements, at least the ones against the companies. But it can turn out to be quite difficult to actually negotiate a global settlement, right? It'd be nice to be able to sort of get everyone on the same page, figure out the amount you've got to pay, what you've got to do in terms of remediation, sign, cut the check, move on, turn the page, have just one bad news day as opposed to several. It doesn't really work that way because different regulators have their own agendas and their own timelines. So the risks here for companies are significant and difficult to assess in advance. So I think that's the main set of points that I wanted to flesh out, aside from, in terms of the sort of the regime and how it works in the global north. The last point I'd want to mention, though, is that something we haven't talked about so far are the local actors, the actors in the host countries, the countries where the corrupt officials are based, right? The Nigerias of this world in the example that Luigi gave. We're still trying to figure out their role in the process of combating corruption because it's obviously contrary to their laws and they've got a clear stake in these matters. But things like, well, if you prosecute a company for paying if the US prosecutes a company for paying bribes in Brazil, what portion of the recovery, what portion of the fine stays in the US as opposed to being shared with the Brazilians? That's something that's still being worked out. And another important issue that I don't think has received as much attention as it should is how do we ensure that that fine, whatever the figure is, and whoever gets it, isn't so large that firms will say, okay, we just can't do this anymore. We can't do business in these countries. Because from a development perspective, we obviously care about corruption and combating it and fighting the cancer of corruption, as the late John Wilkinson said. But it is important to make sure that the cure is not worse than the disease. And that's still something that we'll have to figure out. So I'll stop there. That's my sort of invitation to further discussion, I suspect, and turn it back to Larry.
Thank you so much, Kevin. So I want to pose a few questions. I want to give you each a chance to answer these questions and also to engage and reply to one another. And then we'll turn to our audience and our commentators. A lot of this just picks up where you left off, Kevin. First of all, we are dealing with a rapidly evolving international context. There was some kind of critical juncture of evolution in the international system, as you note, Kevin, when more countries, and particularly OECD countries, began to adopt a version of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It's been my impression that there hasn't been much real enforcement outside the United States. And my understanding has been not that many people have been prosecuted in the US. So if any of you could say a little bit more about actual levels of enforcement, I think everyone would welcome that. Secondly, this has been on my mind since the book I wrote a couple years ago, Ill Winds, plunged me deeper into this issue. I think you can work on the companies and enforcement of the act. You can work on the ground in the country, and I'll come back to that. But a lot of people think now that the most rapid progress can be made in limiting the ability of the recipients of corrupt largesse to enjoy it abroad by more vigorously enforcing anti-money laundering. And this is not just a matter of criminal enforcement, but changing the institutions to make it easier for people like Alex to prosecute and to preempt their ability to enjoy and move the money in the first place. So can each of you comment on what steps we could take, what steps we should take, we, the OECD democracies, to make this more difficult? And two, that of course, many people, including those who are going to enter the Biden administration, including Biden himself, are talking about now are ending the practice of anonymous shell corporations and ending virtually all anonymous real estate transactions in our countries. The other element of the changed international context, I think you mentioned it, Kevin, maybe one of our previous speakers did, is the rise of China. And of course, we've had Malaysian companies and others now just wantonly engaged in bribery without any hint of restraint. But China has entered now as a massive player. And so I'm just wondering how you respond to, or how you would help corporations think through the challenge of international competitiveness when they're tied down by these restraints, and they argue Chinese companies, occasionally Russian companies and others aren't. And just one final thing I'll look over the horizon at is the potential challenge to the system of dollar payments and of having global financial transactions inevitably pass through US financial institutions in one way or another. And I think this is beginning to concern people who are looking at China's rapidly developing plan to develop a global digital currency and electronic payment system. So we'll move back to Luigi, and then to Alex, and then to Kevin, and then on to our audience. Luigi?
So Larry, thanks for, you ask a lot of very difficult questions. Let me first react to the comment that Alex and Kevin made. I feel a little bit depressed from their comments, to be honest, in the sense, of course, corruption has been going on at least since Roman time, probably much before that. But that doesn't mean we cannot change that. I think that sexual harassment and mistreatment of women has been going on since before Roman time, but we're trying to change it. And I think that, as you pointed out, at the turn of the century, the millennium, there was a change in the OECD that said we can't accept no more these kind of things. In Germany, until that time, you could deduct in your as expense the bribes you pay in foreign countries until 99. Now you can't do anymore, and it is illegal. And I think that maybe I'm too much of an idealist, but I think that it's very hard to defend the system we have of cooperation, especially cooperation that try to maximize shareholders' value, etc., if we don't respect laws. And this is a fundamental law. And I think that particularly when it comes to developing countries, but not only those, we have this view, oh, this country are corrupt, but it takes two to tango, and these countries are corrupt because we corrupt them. Even within Europe, everybody said, oh, because Greece is corrupt. But you know who pays the bribes in Greece? It's Germany. And so you can't just blame the victim. It's like in a prostitution case, you only blame the prostitute, but the Johns are at least as responsible. So if we don't do something to stop this, I think that the entire system will lose, in my view, the credibility. And also we're going to do enormous damages, particularly to countries where we have weak institutions. Because I think that it is a kind of form of new colonialism that we impose on other countries, and we should fight against that. And I agree with Alex that I'm not so sure that you want to impose criminal liabilities to every board member. However, I think that there is a concerted attempt to be willfully ignorant. And I think that the reason why my behavior was seen as terrible is precisely because I was destroying the plausible deniability. I was looking at the internal reports and say, I think there are some holes in my view. And then they pay fancy lawyers who come in and say that everything is fine. Those are the same fancy lawyers that, as Global Witness has demonstrated, if you go to New York and you ask for launder some money, most of them, including at the time the head of the American Bar Association, are there to help. So I think that if we cannot have an impact on that level of criminality, I think that I don't think that we can defend, honestly, our system of capitalism. So we need to do something, and I think that in my view, the soft spot are the board members, because the board members have not their life tied in the company. They are the ones that are supposed to monitor the company from outside. And I think that the internal control system that Alex was talking about, number one, you should make at least civilly responsible board members if they don't have a good internal control system. And if they do have a good internal control system, I think is impossible that large bribes, maybe the bribe paid to a foreign official at the custom, the $50 bribe slips in, but that's not going to change the world. But the $100 million bribes must be visible. And once you have the good system in place and they don't see them, they purposely don't see that, then I think you can put criminal liability. I don't think that any other things will go in that direction. Now, I am with Larry that bringing transparency in cooperation, transparency in beneficial ownership of all cooperation, starting in the United States, will be a very important step in easing enforcement. But I think without the other step, I don't think we go very far.
Alex, before we come to you, I want to ratchet up the pressure on you in this sense, and thank you, Luigi, for those compelling remarks. I'll just say I spent the first 20 years of my career studying Nigeria. And I think probably during that time, and maybe still to this day, and certainly in a case like Angola or Kazakhstan, the vast majority of the corruption that's being extracted from the wealth that could legitimately flow to the people is not coming through bribes. It's coming through just straightforward diversion of public resources. And often in some of these countries, just opening up the veins of the central banking system and transferring money. So I don't want to minimize the importance, not only for combating corruption, but as Luigi said, for defending the health and integrity of capitalism, of looking at the corporate side. But if we don't look at the recipient side of all forms of corrupt wealth, and they're not stealing this money so they can enjoy it in Nigeria and Angola. They're stealing it so they can enjoy it in Portugal and London and the United States. So anyway, over to you, Alex.
That was the least pressured topic that you've raised. Basically, everything else you said is an effort to get me in a massive amount of trouble when someone at the Department of Justice sees that I'm lobbying Congress for changes on a public video. But that one we can talk about. That's fine. But let me talk about that one last. Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right, Larry. And candidly, the work that I and my unit do is frankly more focused on the money laundering kleptocracy side of this. the expropriation and theft of foreign national assets than it is the FCPA. For those who don't know, there is an FCPA unit in the Department of Justice in DC, which is required essentially to be involved in all those cases. So we don't do standalone FCPA cases, just us, which means, for better or for worse, I think we view our role as more important on the money laundering side, where we just run our cases, than in the FCPA context, where there's an entire other entity that has a lot of say about how they're handled. That is a huge problem. I'm not sure it's a corporate problem. And in some ways, that is what makes it trickier. One of the places you can have a good degree of visibility into what's going on with corruption in a foreign country is through, your multinational entity, if they're the ones paying the bribe, right? We can subpoena those people. We can pull people in for interviews. If the company is scared enough, they'll cooperate. People who are disturbed by this can whistleblow, and you can build up your case through the internal records and testimony of people on the bribe paying side from the corporation. If you have the president of a country wherever just looting corporate assets and then running them through a series of intermediaries and shell companies to lodge them in a brokerage account or real estate or what have you in the US, there are a lot fewer players outside of that country who can give you the necessary evidence to make that type of case. And so those cases present their own substantial difficulties that can be worked through, but are very challenging. I think the biggest problem you see there is that almost all of our charges, with one exception, which I'll just mention, though it's a little inside baseball perhaps, almost all of our charges require that we're going to prove that underlying theft of government assets. Doing that without cooperation from the home country from who the assets were stolen is extraordinarily difficult in almost all cases. And unless your president has fallen, you rarely see that type of cooperation, obviously. They don't help you catch them themselves. So where cases like that tend to be made is either where the government has fallen or there's been some falling out among thieves in the country, and someone comes forward and will give information to law enforcement in other countries that will help you start the tracing process. Finding the assets is its own problem, but that's a substantially less fundamental problem than proving where they came from in the first instance. And a lot of these cases start with something that looks suspicious in money flows or property purchases, and we start working backwards. And there, candidly, are a lot of cases where you hit a wall past some point at which you can't go to prove where it came from. And that can really complicate your ability to charge people. One solution that is, I think, relatively new, that certainly my office has been doing a lot more aggressively in the last few years, is looking to our bank fraud statute. Because you can charge a standalone bank fraud if you've been lying to the bank about the source of funds in order to move money through the US financial system, even if you don't prove what that money actually was. As long as you can prove it wasn't auto parts, which is what's on the invoice they provided, you can make a good case. And so that's one solution we've sort of internally within the department come up with to try and be able to prosecute some of those cases and forfeit that money. The other issue there is often we're not going to prosecute the president of country X, at least not generally. They haven't let me do it yet. But we're going to prosecute, but we can forfeit the $100 million we found in real estate that's sitting around here. That's sort of the one IMDb case involving the Malaysian investment fund, which is a big one the department has done recently. That all starts with finding the money and locking down huge sums of it that had moved into the US financial system, and then they've worked back to various criminal prosecutions. In terms of sort of your questions about what I'm in a position to say about stuff we could do to make all of that easier. Yes, to some extent, changes to money laundering laws and more vigorous AML enforcement might do things. I can't really get into it to say how much I think about particular pieces of legislation or what have you. But the one caution I would have, because I see a lot of folks talk about the anonymous shell corporation problem. It's obviously a very hot issue. Frankly, from a news alert I got earlier today, it sounds like Congress may be passing legislation as part of the appropriations bill that's going through this week that will address that. But setting aside, in every case we prosecute, even outside of the kleptocracy space, we routinely see cases where you don't have an anonymous entity. What you have is an entity with a nominee shell owner who's not available to you because he's in, you know, Benin or the BVI or Thailand, whatever. And so it's not as helpful as I think some people might think for me to have a name attached to that shell company. I can almost invariably subpoena somebody in the United States and get the identity of the person who's representing the company in any transaction. The problem is once I have that name and that person isn't subject to US process, isn't readily gettable, isn't in a friendly jurisdiction, it doesn't help me that much. It saves a step. And I'm not saying it's a good idea or a bad idea because I am not commenting on any legislation before Congress right now. But it is not a cure-all, and I feel like sometimes people are focused on it to the exclusion of other issues. The biggest of which is, frankly, and there's not obviously solutions, but going to your other questions, international cooperation. The biggest problem you have in these types of cases is that in a routine investigation of kleptocracy, there are 6 different countries who have information about it from some stage in the chain. And I don't think I'm going to get in trouble for saying that nobody is very good at making that that work smoothly, seamlessly, and effectively to share that type of information, except in very unusual circumstances.
Okay, Kevin?
Okay, so before I try to answer your questions, Larry, let me just make one comment about the nature of the problem as I see it. Just because so far we've been focusing, not necessarily inappropriately, on the amount of money that can be lost. But I think it's important to remember that sometimes the harm that's associated with corruption isn't necessarily monetizable. Because when I think of the worst case of corruption that I've come across, it's not one where, say, $10 billion was stolen from Nigeria, which is actually being revealed right now in one case. But it was actually a case involving a company called Innospec that paid bribes to be allowed to continue selling leaded gasoline in Iraq and Indonesia. And I don't know if you're familiar with the studies on the effects of leaded gasoline on child development, but it's really horrendous, right? In terms of the neurological effects, diminished impulse control, reduced IQ. A lot of people think that the elimination of leaded gasoline in the US is what's responsible for the decline in crime rates over the past 3 decades or so. So that form of corruption, I think, has enormous effects. It causes enormous harm, is truly immoral, even though it doesn't involve billions of dollars and may not fit the definition of grand corruption that Luigi started off with. So I had to get that off my chest because we're focusing so much on the money. In terms of what can be done and levels of enforcement, there's disagreement about the extent to which the US is enforcing and how enforcement patterns have changed over time. May have declined over the past few years. It's a bit hard to say though, because there's been a bit of a shift towards individual prosecutions as opposed to corporate prosecutions. Outside the US, I think the trend has been towards increasing enforcement on the part of a lot of the OECD countries. But it's also hard to track that because even when those countries aren't prosecuting, sometimes, as Alex pointed out, they're cooperating in US investigations. And the extent of that cooperation, I gather, although Alex could speak more to this, has increased over time and the quality has improved. And so that also has to be factored into analysis of trends in enforcement and so forth. But for me, the big point is that no matter what the US authorities do, they're going to have limited leverage, right? And for that matter, no matter what directors do, there's a limit to how much control they're going to have over what people at the lower echelons of the firm can do. So as far as the US authorities are concerned, one big problem is some of the most potent tools come from the accounting controls, those internal controls that Alex was talking about. Those only apply to companies that are listed in the US. Many of you will be familiar with the fact that the number of publicly traded firms in the US, especially foreign firms, is declining steadily and has been declining steadily, and it's probably not going to change. So that means from an enforcement perspective, there are just that many fewer companies that are subject to the most potent parts of the US regime. And then from an international perspective, the sort of rise of China means that, again, there are very large number of firms out there, a very substantial number of firms doing business in countries that the US firms also operate in that are well beyond the reach of US law. And as Larry pointed out, to the extent that the dollar ceases to become the sort of world's reserve currency, the amount of leverage that US enforcement authorities enjoy under the money laundering laws will also decline. So I think no matter what we propose for the US regime, it's important to take that broader context into account and realize that the solutions will have to occur in other countries as well, in starting most likely at the local level in the countries where the corrupt officials are based.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Let me try now to, there's so many questions in the chat box here. That it's going to be a little bit of a challenge to, and I just lost my own window. So a couple of these, Alex, I realize you may not be able to comment on, including this one, but for Kevin and Luigi, if you know about the first energy corruption case in Ohio right now, do you have any comment on its potential deterrent impact? The company appeared to have commitments for political influence, transparency, and oversight, but there's a wide-ranging corruption case right now. And then this might be something that Alex could comment on, whether the Department of Justice pays special attention to private capital interests and agents thereof who allegedly violate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, since the SEC has some concurrent authority to enforce against public issuers and agents. Let's see, a questioner would be interested in all of your views on the interaction of corporate criminal regulatory sanctions and shareholder litigation, particularly with the renewed viability or so-called Caremark lawsuits brought by shareholders against corporate fiduciaries for failure to monitor legal compliance that leads to the corporation paying a large fine or settlement. These claims are ironic since they, well, anyway, I think you get the point. We're gonna have to move soon to our panelists. Kevin, someone would like to know if you have a good book to recommend on the history of Roman mercantile corruption. But Luigi, you wanna respond to any of this?
Not particular, but I have a question for Alex, which is related to your point, Larry, that was very well raised about not helping kleptocracy. And the question for Alex is the following. So suppose I am a minister of oil in an oil-rich country, and I award myself a license while in office, of course, with a shell company. Then I step down from office. Everybody knows that I awarded that illegally to myself. So that's kleptocracy. But then if I'm a foreign company and I buy that asset, am I buying a stolen good to some extent? So am I sort of responsible for that? And to what extent this is a way to pursue what Larry wants, which is to stop kleptocracy, because at the end of the day, not only they want to enjoy in the United States, but they need to cash out before they enjoy. And most of the most effective way to cash out of the stolen good is to sell to foreign corporations. So is that in the current legislation a legitimate way to attack that problem?
I don't know, Luigi. It doesn't sound like that's that much of a hypothetical. Are you trying to get me in trouble? Feels a little bit like you are. So treating that as a hypothetical. If a foreign company buys the asset, let's take these as steps. If the oil minister has illegally given himself a oil concession that belongs to the country in violation of foreign law, that's check one. If the foreign company does a transaction with the minister for that property that touches the United States, then I think that that's potentially chargeable as money laundering. Yes. If the foreign company pays the foreign minister in euros in a duffel bag in the foreign country, then that maybe there's a complicated FCPA question depending on controls and the like, but it's not at all clear to me that that becomes a US violation, except in very unusual circumstances. But yeah, if you pay $100 million through a US correspondent account to someone to buy their stolen national property and you know you're doing it, yeah, that'd be a money laundering charge.
But is a money laundering is not a violation of FCPA.
I don't, not if you're just buying it and not, let me not.
So just buying. Yeah.
This is definitely a part where I'm going to have a problem at some point. So let's say that sounds to me like you would have a solid case for potential prosecution without drilling too down into the weeds of the analysis.
Okay.
Kevin's also nodding at me, so I think I got it right.
Yeah, can I just jump in on one part though, just to emphasize your first step in the analysis though, that it has to be illegal under the local law. And so of course, what often happens is the minister will just make sure that it's actually lawful under local law. And if he does that, then it's not gonna satisfy that first requirement for it to be money laundering in the US. So the truly systemic corruption that involves conduct that's legal locally is not something that the US will be able to get at using those tools.
Yeah, just to that's exactly right. What's the true systemic cooperation, what's the corruption, what's not, I won't comment on. But yeah, to the extent something is being done through corrupt but lawful due to the overwhelming corruption of the system means in the host country, I cannot turn that into a US criminal case. Barring like the type of bank fraud laws we discussed earlier, frankly, there may be ways and we might look at it, but it's not a clear core US criminal violation in that world.
I want to bring in some of our panelists, but Alex or Kevin, do you want to respond to any of the other questions that were posed? I'm sorry, they were a bit complicated.
I can't talk about First Energy. You're 100% correct, Larry. On the focus on private entities, since they don't have the concurrent SEC jurisdiction, the answer is I don't think so. I think we look at those like we look at anybody, but there is not a special focus on them. But in fairness, that is definitely the type of policy focus that would be happening within the FCPA unit at Main Justice, not something I would necessarily be focused on. So it is entirely possible that someone is paying special attention to those types of investigations without telling me, except when one comes to our office, that the reason we opened it is because we were paying special attention. And I candidly don't remember what the third question
was. Kevin?
I think the third question was about the interaction between shareholder litigation under Caremark and FCPA enforcement actions, I think. And thanks for bringing that up. It is worth keeping in mind that these enforcement actions that are brought by the Department of Justice and the SEC, they'll turn up facts that plaintiff side law firms will very quickly turn into lawsuits. And so they'll sue the directors, among other things, for breach of their fiduciary duties under standard known as the Caremark standard, which basically says they have to do the kinds of things that, or they should do the kinds of things that Luigi wants them to do, which is to take care to make sure that the company isn't violating the laws. It's not, directors basically have to check the right boxes and take the right steps. and then they can avoid liability. That's my sort of very, very crude understanding of the standard that the courts are applying. But it does, lead to settlements. Those lawsuits have led to settlements. They've benefited the plaintiffs' lawyers and I guess the shareholders or party to them. And so they are something that firms have to pay attention to as well.
Great.
Oh, and the book, the other one. No book to recommend. My book has a half chapter on it, but I didn't find any other book on Roman corruption. Sorry.
Book. This is your opportunity,
Oh,
Kevin.
I have it right here. This was not intentional, but between impunity and imperialism.
Let's now go to a kind of lightning round of specific questions from our panelists. We'll start with Jennifer Taub, who has a question for Alex.
I have to unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. First of all, I want to again thank Anat and all the panelists and you, Larry, as the moderator. I learned so much, and I think I liked your clarity and honesty, and your story about being on the board, Luigi, is what corporate law professors always worry about, and what I write about. But it's kind of harrowing to hear it from you directly. My question is directed at Alex, and I know this might fall outside of your business unit, but generally speaking, are you aware of the responsible corporate officer doctrine, which now sort of explain to the non-lawyers here? The responsible corporate officer doctrine allows the prosecution, at the very least in the context of social welfare statutes like the Food and Drug Act or environmental statutes, to successfully prosecute a CEO or a business leader who has the responsibility for a particular unit or behavior, but actually fails to prevent the harm. It's been used in a small area, limited number of cases, and was recently upheld in the case involving Quality Egg. At any rate, so I'm wondering what your thoughts might be, Alex, or anyone else in the panel, about expanding the use of that doctrine so we can reach higher level people, not just the person thrown under the bus in the foreign country who's paying the bribe. If we actually believe there's someone higher up at the corporate setting in the US who is encouraging and even aware of, even though that's not even an element of the doctrine, to go after them. Because I think one of the problems with incentives here is we can't go after the people really responsible because there's not evidence. Anyway, thoughts on that, Alex, or anyone else?
Sure. So to take sort of the first part of the question, have we ever considered it? I definitely have not, and have only the vaguest familiarity with the doctrine, frankly. You're absolutely right. It's not within the areas we work on. I don't think it could be reconciled with the willfulness standard that all of the statutes we're talking about basically adopt. So I think you'd be talking about a legislative change, which, as discussed, if we were going to change what these laws say, I'm not allowed to opine on it one way or the other anyway. But that's my take, is that as a practical matter, I don't see a way you could argue that that's consistent with FCPA, with the money laundering statutes, with really any of the existing tools to deal with this.
Thank you.
Next, call on Mark Mizruchi. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, this was originally supposed to be for Kevin, but Alex actually mentioned something about it, and I think I was hoping all three of you could speak to it. So I have this vague memory of a case a few years ago that involved a big US company. It might have been Walmart, and they were doing business in Mexico. And there was a case in which they had bribed some local officials, and their defense was, well, this was seen as just part of the customs of the country, and what we did was not necessary. We didn't see it as illegal. They didn't see it as illegal. It was just, this is what you do in these cases. And I guess my question is is this for real? Was that just an excuse? Is this a genuine problem? It sounds like in the case of Nigeria, they do have clear laws against bribing public officials. I don't know what the situation's like in Mexico or other countries, but if at least the two of you, if not all three of you, could speak to that, I'd be interested in what you had to say.
Kevin?
I'm familiar with the case that you're thinking of. The Walmart case is basically was resolved recently. That defense generally doesn't fly. What would fly is, as Alex said, if the conduct is actually lawful under the written laws of the foreign jurisdiction, but that's not the case anywhere, basically. Paying bribes and accepting bribes is unlawful just about everywhere. There is a defense in the FCPA for what are called facilitation payments, but it's construed very, very narrowly by the Department of Justice, and that wouldn't, that's the most I can say in 30 seconds or so. But if you're paying substantial amounts of money to expedite the approvals of permits for your stores to be opened, to be built, in violation of Mexican law, that generally wouldn't cut it. Alex, does that sound fair?
Yeah, it's just the custom of the country to bribe people in violation of local law is not a thing. It's not a thing that people will say. That corporate counsel will tell you how it wasn't that big a deal, but it is certainly not a legal defense. And I am comfortable saying that relatively few of I and my brethren are persuaded that that's a mitigating factor in the circumstances most of us will ever hear it. Let's put it that way.
Any comment, Luigi?
No.
Let me call on Martin Wolf next then.
I have two questions and you can divide them as you want. But my first question is, I really think, if I may, for you, you can decide not to answer it. But since I've got the opportunity to ask a question of a person, I think the world's leading expert on democracy, and I want to ask a question. We are talking about corruption and the attack on it through law, particularly American law. But it seems to me, having a very different perspective, not being a lawyer, that this is a moral issue at the core of politics. So the question I have, which you may or may not want to answer, is how far, in your view, do you think that the current administration has eroded the credibility of the US as a voice against grand corruption in the world, grand or small? And the second question I have is for the lawyers, but it's not a legal question, is if you look at the efforts you have made, and you probably know literature here, can you judge in any way how far you have been successful on any criterion in reducing the scale of corruption in the countries that you have been dealing with?
Okay, let's start with our three panelists, and thank you, Martin. Then I'll briefly answer your question. Luigi, come to you first.
I think that is, I'm no expert on this, but there is no doubt that at least the image of Trump has reduced the credibility of the United States to fight this. And I think that I'm hopeful that it can make a difference the way the enforcement is made, but I'm becoming actually more pessimistic after this panel. And I think the only solution is a corporate governance solution that goes maybe through ESG. If the shareholders speak up and say, we don't want to make money by corrupting foreign officials in Nigeria, I think that the company should adapt to that and becomes sort of a corporate governance violation, not maybe a criminal violation. But it's going to be a long fight.
Alex?
Yeah, I'm going to pass on the administration question. I know you're surprised. In terms of sort of looking at the efforts we've made, how successful we've been, it's a great question. I don't have a very satisfying answer to it. I think in some respects, sort of the amount of bribery and the amount of kleptocracy is a little bit of a dark number in that we obviously don't know what we don't know, and we don't have good ways to estimate how much is going through the system that we're not catching. And if you do it by, how many people we're catching, you can read that number two different ways. If it goes up, maybe we're catching more, or maybe it means there's more activity, and vice versa. If it goes down, that doesn't necessarily mean there's less corruption. It may just mean we're catching fewer people. I think that at least at the line level where I sit, as opposed to at the policy side down in DC, we don't have great metrics for this in the way we do for, say, our effects on gang activity in New York City, to see how we're doing. And I do think that that is sometimes a problem in our ability to properly target the work that we do. We are sort of inherently case focused sometimes, and we have initiatives, but it would be enormously useful to have a better sense of what results we're getting and what overall volumes of this sort of activity are. People put out estimates. I know that the Treasury Department does at a regular basis about how much dirty money they think is being laundered and things like that. But this is frankly an area where I think, academia and the private sector could be enormously helpful. And we probably don't interact enough, because I candidly just am not sure how much faith to give to those sorts of estimates. And it would be good if you could take a step back and say, the last 5 years, how have we done? Have we really, hit this problem hard? And at least, as I say, what's getting pushed out to the field in the department is not something that allows me to meaningfully assess that.
So just on that last question, this is something that's been at the top of my mind for the past little while, actually. How would we measure the effectiveness of this regime? And the answer is we don't know very much right now. I think that's right. There have been a few efforts, though, to look at the impact on firm behavior largely. So there have been one or two in-country surveys of firms where you can ask them if they've paid a bribe recently, and then you can focus on the firms that are subject to the FCPA, let's say, or actually to some OECD countries' foreign bribery regime, as opposed to all the other firms, and see if anything changed in their responses to the question, have you paid a bribe? So there's been at least one study of that sort. There have also been studies that look at variations in flows of foreign direct investment, and also sort of levels of operations in countries, and actually share prices. And so they've looked at firms that are basically subject to either new regimes, like the expansion of the OECD convention, or enhanced levels of enforcement, and tried to see if there's been an impact on FDI or just the sort of sales into high-risk jurisdictions and so forth. None of that is perfect, but my sense is that increased enforcement has had an effect on the behavior of the firms, the largest firms that are subject to it, sort of large publicly traded firms listed in the US and so forth. Beyond that, it's not clear, because we don't know what's happened, as Alex said, to the other firms, and whether they've just picked up the slack, for instance. So that's the big question that I think academic researchers in cooperation, not just with enforcement officials in the OECD, but also locally, might be able to get some traction on.
In response to Martin's first question, I'm going to issue a trigger warning to Alex. He may not even want his
I'll earmuff it. It's fine.
When I say what I'm going to say, but Martin, I know you're a very astute student of history, so I'll just say I think it's just much too early to know how bad the damage will have been, and I think the damage keeps being piled on by what President Trump continues to do to try and question the integrity of the election and keep violating democratic norms and rules by trying to rip away electoral college delegations. I think that we will be judged in part by our pursuit of accountability. And I'll just say, taking it more to the context of this conversation, I'm really a rule of law kind of guy. And I think the most important thing going forward is that we pursue transparency and accountability for how the business of government has been conducted in these last 4 years. And if there is validity to the suspicions, which I strongly harbor, that this is the most corrupt administration probably in a century, I think we need neutral, non-political prosecutors pursuing the evidence, whether it touches on the president's family or the president himself or not. This is going to be a controversial statement, but I think that the president himself should be prosecuted if it can be determined that he was guilty of major acts of corruption. So with that minor comment now, and knowing that there's very little time left, I'm going to call on Karthik, Ramana, and Joseph Grundfest to briefly pose their questions. Frank Fukuyama, I had asked you if you thought your question on money laundering was adequately answered. I didn't hear from you, but Karthik, why don't you start?
Thanks. So this has been a conference on corporations and the subversion of the rule of law by corporations. And we spent the last couple of days thinking about ways in which corporations have done that and how we might address it. And then we've seen how the media has not done their job and how elected politicians have not done their job. And today we were hoping that in some sense, the anti-corruption lawyers on this panel would suggest that there are some tools from the corruption toolkit that might help us address this problem of the way corporations are subverting the rules of the game, particularly in the Western world and in the United States. So I'd love to see if there are any ways in which we can address that issue of regulatory capture from the anti-corruption toolkit.
Okay, Joe?
Forgive me, but Luigi, with all due respect, I wonder whether your experience is typical or atypical. Profound problem. I don't think there's any way to challenge it. We run a database at Stanford, fcpa.stanford.edu, where we track all FCPA actions by the SEC and also by DOJ. And we've got the most complete publicly available free statistics monitoring all of this stuff. So where I stand on this is just unambiguous. But to extrapolate from ENI to general corporate experience is questionable. ENI is a recidivist violator of the FCPA laws. All right, the Securities and Exchange Commission recently announced a settlement with with ENI because of bribery in Algeria, and there's the prior settlement with the DOJ and also with the SEC coming out of Nigeria. There's a very small number of corporations that are recidivist violators, and to extrapolate from that experience to all corporations everywhere is perhaps not the most sound statistical technique. And let me just observe from another end. There are a whole bunch of corporations, and Alex and I can give you names, that actually self-report to the SEC and to the DOJ, where they come in and they say, look, we found this violation. Here's how it's happened. Let's get together. Let's fix it. In addition, corporations are spending hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in the aggregate on FCPA compliance. I'm a former SEC commissioner. I chair the audit committee at KKR. From our perspective, an FCPA problem, if one comes up, is a threat to our franchise. It's the last thing that we can afford. We have been victimized by FCPA violations. We bought a company in Brazil. We spent millions of dollars on FCPA compliance. We hired consultants. Everybody swore to us there was no problem. We owned the company for a few months. Guess what we discovered? Massive bribery. We lost all of our equity investment. The failure to discover that corruption in Brazil cost us $400 million. Right? We were victimized. Basically, all of our equity in that deal was wiped out. Yes, we self-reported to the authorities. Interesting situation. It's one where we were the victim of the corruption. And despite having all of the right incentives, spending millions of dollars in due diligence to try to find the problem, The best experts in the world didn't find it. That's another one of the problems. And by the way, we're in no rush to invest in Brazil, right, in any time in the future. And that's one of the collateral consequences. Capital is not going there because we can't be sure that if we invest in Brazil, we're not buying into a fraud. We lose our money. We then have a problem with Alex. Nobody wants that. Go on there. So to extrapolate from E&I, which is a recidivist violator to all of corporate America, is I would respectfully suggest inappropriate. And then also to extrapolate from the experience of a company that has lost hundreds of millions of dollars because it didn't find a violation, maybe is inappropriate from the other extreme. And I would suggest that we have a spectrum of perspectives in corporate America when it comes to enforcement and compliance.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. We're going to go in reverse order now. And Luigi, then I'm going to ask you to conclude as you began, but in this case, by also responding, this is unfair to do to you because you won't have much time, to the last question I have specifically for you. What you're really advocating, I think, is a pretty profound change in the culture of capitalism, certainly as corporations practice it. And I'm just wondering if you have any brief thoughts on how we change culture. Kevin?
To answer that question as well. Okay. First with Karthik's question about the extent to which the anti-corruption regime can tackle problems of regulatory capture more generally. I think the big challenge will be the point that came up in the interchange with Alex earlier, which is that the anti-corruption regime is aimed at conduct that is unlawful where it occurs. And so my sense of a lot of the forms of regulatory capture that people are concerned about, including say campaign finance and so forth, is that it's perfectly lawful. If you haven't checked that box for the unlawful transaction, then it's going to be hard to trigger the types of statutes that Alex and I have been talking about. So that's 1.1. And then Larry, in response to your question, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think from what Joe Grundfest was just saying that, you know, for a lot of corporate America, the culture is one of compliance, is one of avoiding corruption, not only because of the legal requirements and the really quite drastic penalties that can be imposed if you're caught, but also because of people's personal moral scruples. I think a lot of, I would like to believe that a lot of people in business, not just in corporate America, but around the world, do think that corruption is wrong. And polls consistently show that. And so no, I don't think that advocating for not paying bribes and not facilitating money laundering and embezzlement entails a radical change in the culture of capitalism. I think that's what a lot of people think capitalism is all about.
Good. Okay, Alex?
Yeah, I think Kevin sort of answered the question in many respects the way I would have, which is to say the anti-corruption tools we have for problems abroad, I think, are used very effectively by the department domestically here as well. Everyone seems to have sorry. Someone was nodding. For a minute, I thought everyone had frozen on me and no one was hearing anything I was saying. Anyway, they are used well. You bribe people in the United States or you launder their money and we will prosecute you. And I think we do a much more effective job of that than we do it overseas, where there are a great many additional challenges. Not to say that we're perfect or catching everybody, but I think those tools are well serving their intended goal. Once you start talking about other forms of corruption not currently illegal here, we are well outside of my area. And then I think to the one other point that I'd make, because I think I, again, agree with Kevin, at least to some extent, I do think that there is a danger in some of these conversations of assuming that the bad actors in sort of corporate environments, of whom there are undoubtedly plenty, represent something like a majority or the whole swath of entities. The people I deal with most often, frankly, are banks, and there are obviously banks who have committed crimes and have been bad actors, and there are bankers who are criminals and have committed criminal offenses. But with that said, there's just a huge amount of particularly compliance people, but just also ordinary bank employees that we interact with, who are the ones who are finding, detecting, and reporting crime to us, who are seeing something and picking up the phone, who are helping us make the cases and find the problems, and who are working really very hard often to try and do the right thing by not just their customers, but by the system more broadly. And I do worry that sometimes we are not focused on it. And those are, frankly, a very underappreciated set of people. Like, bank compliance officers don't get a whole lot of love a lot of the time, and they should get more. And we should keep in mind that corporate America is filled, I think, with a lot of people who are trying to do the right thing and are often very law enforcement friendly and critical to our efforts to do anything in this space. Which I guess takes me back also to Joe's point, which is corporations self-reporting FCPA problems and all sorts of other problems is where a huge amount of these cases can come from and get made, when the right people at a corporation, or sometimes new ownership, see something, recognize it's a problem, and tell us about it so that we can make a case. There are probably more of those than almost any other type of sort of basis for initiation of investigations in this space. We don't spot these things on our own more frequently than we're told about them by good actors in the private sector.
Great, thank you. Luigi, the final words are yours.
Thank you, Larry. So first, answering to Joe, I wasn't trying to say that my experience of any is representative of what happens in corporate America, but I think that establishes, at least in my view, that the incentives are not there. And my people might behave morally for other reasons, but the incentive for board members to be very active, at least they're not there. And I think that's important, not only for corporate America, for the world. And this is the trial where Eni is in involves also Shell. We know that Siemens is bribing massively. I think that people say that Total is not great either. And you keep going and talking about the Chinese companies and so on and so forth. So I think that the problem is quite big. It's also quite big in America. The Walmart case that was just mentioned earlier is suggesting that you can get away with bribing in America today if you are as big as Walmart. So the problem is big. And if I remember correctly, when the FCPI was introduced, shortly after, there was a kind of a forgiveness program that if you came forward, you would be absolved. And the DOJ was shocked of how many companies came and reported. So at least at the time, this was massive in America. I hope to believe that this has changed. It's not as massive as it was, though, but I think it's far from being marginal in America, and is, I can tell you, probably dominant in the rest of the world. And I think that this is what we need to think about, how to change it. My conclusion on this panel is pessimistic. I don't see a lot of action coming from the legal side. I think that probably the best action is to the corporate governance side. As Kevin was saying, there are a lot of people, investors, managers, employees who don't want to operate in a company that is corrupting, or don't want to operate in a company that poison people in Iraq. And I think that we need to channel these forces in order to make a difference. Thank you.
Well, I thank, first of all three of you for your lucidity and precision in answering the questions.